Hello, welcome to GDC 2024, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is James Sheehan. I'm a senior game designer at the Multiplayer Group. I've been in the game industry over 25 years, and I've been a game designer for over 15 of those, during which I've been very fortunate to work on all sorts of games and genres. For 4 years, from 2017, I designed the tabletop game Fallout Wasteland Warfare. It's a miniatures game based on the Fallout video games. And this talk will look at how I converted the Fallout gameplay and its world from video game to tabletop, and why I made the choices that I did. At every step, though, I noticed the same question arose: when to be different, but when to be the same. So we'll look at how setting the boundaries helped me understand the type of game required, how the setting itself heavily influenced the decisions and game design, and also how some of the game mechanics were or were not included. If you've not played Fallout, Fallout is an action-adventure game with combat and survival set in a post-apocalyptic setting with a lot of storyline and quests. It did start as a strategy game for the first couple of versions, but recent versions have been open world. So first of all, what boundaries were there? Because we never designed in a vacuum, so exploring and understanding the boundaries from the start was essential. So boundaries set our design space, and then once we know those, we know that anything within that is what's possible. So first, the license itself. So the publisher had the license for a miniatures game, and the license for a board game was already held by another company. So therefore, no boards, right from the start. So that meant I'd need rules to allow free movement and not use printed spaces, and also a system to measure that movement. So therefore, it was going to be a war game. So from this on the left to that on the right. So this was really helpful, big first step, but of course there was a lot more to work out. So there were two key audiences. The first one was existing fans of Fallout. That's a huge audience covering a wide spectrum of gamers. Some would be tabletop gamers, and some of those would be war gamers. But there's no point having such a really big license if you don't appeal and sell widely to this existing group of Fallout existing fans. So I had to assume that a small proportion of these fans would have wargame experience. So I'd actually need to make it quite an accessible game, and I'll refer to this group as general gamers as we go on. They would expect narrative and story, which I'll talk about a bit later, so it would feel like the video games. The other group were wargamers. So much more dedicated players, they purchase a lot of miniatures, play competitively. Excuse me. So some would be familiar with the Fallout video games, but also some would not. So this group, they'd accept a higher complexity. It's not required, but it definitely needs enough to provide gameplay depth. And they generally favour balance over the narrative experience due to often playing competitively. The trouble is, the danger of trying to appeal to two different audiences is it can require too many compromises and result in not appealing to either of them. And just before I move on, I should mention that we decided early on to make a separate cut-down version of the rules for competitive play. So that's playing in like tournaments or in store. And that's because competitive play is so different to playing just for fun. I mean, it's fun to play competitively, but just when there's nothing riding on it. And competitive play requires as little randomization as possible beyond the dice rolling. So no drawing cards, no events. So that meant I'd need to design the game so these story elements could be removed if needed for that. So what about other products in the same space? So we could use a couple of criteria to map out the competitive landscape at that time. Using size and complexity. So I mentioned the different requirements for complexity from the two audiences. Wasteland Warfare needed to be simple, but not too simple, to suit both the audiences, so that white bar in the middle. The complexity of X-Wing felt like a really good level for this, but it couldn't be as simple as X-Wing. As well, X-Wings move and shoot. They don't need to pick locks or hack terminals or climb buildings. So the area shown would be the target in terms of complexity. And then there's size, by which I mean the rough number of models on the table during a game. The action in the Fallout video games is skirmish level at most, just a few on either side. There are very few large battles, so a lower miniature count would fit Fallout well. But it also allow greater focus on the individual characters, which is great, because that's more like the video games. And it would also make it more affordable to general gamers who may not purchase as many extra miniatures. But also, skirmish level war games at that time was a growing area and still is. So the area shown would be the target and actually fit pretty well for both of these two audiences. So around here would be good. But Fallout's got such a lot of story, there's actually a third dimension that I thought I'd consider. And by story, I'll talk about that quite a lot. Story narrative is what I think happens during the game, rather than pure combat, where just you get some intro text at the start. But other war games don't really have this. Middle-earth strategy game has a bit, so it's raised there on the z-axis, but stories really seem more in board games. Meanwhile, the Fallout video games are heavily narrative, so they'd be really high on the story axis. So story would give Wasteland Warfare an opportunity to stand out, whilst also being required anyway to portray the Fallout license. However, would the intended audiences accept things being done differently at all? And if so, how different? If a new game is not different to an existing game, why would players leave the game they already play or are already invested in? But if a new game is too different, well, they won't play it or they won't even consider it. So we need to be somewhere in the middle, a bit different, but not too different. Now, a license is a difference, but I would argue a license is almost never, certainly never, enough on its own to be the only difference. So it needs something else is needed to move it across into that green section. So some difference in the gameplay and/or rules is needed to make it different. And actually, it's those rules changes that are what are needed to make the game feel like the license's experience. However, players may surprise you what they consider as too adventurous. These are the dice in Wasteland Warfare, and I'll discuss them later. But when I was demoing Wasteland Warfare at a show, a passerby took one glance and said to their friend, "Ugh, it's got those role-playing dice," and rolled their eyes and wandered off. So even the number of sides in your dice can be too much for some players. But it was a reminder, though, that not all players see the same changes the same way, and it's also important not to overstep the mark, for too many of them at least. So already, I could see there were boundaries that would help shape the game, but there are also some conflicts, primarily between these two audiences, which I'd need to cater to. So, understanding the setting was also essential too, especially the limitations or requirements it may create. How similar could Wasteland Warfare be, and how similar did it need to be? So knowing the source material was understandably vital. At this point, when I started the project, I'd played probably about 70-odd hours of Fallout 4, so I felt I had a good start. But I mined any source material I could find, absolutely everything. So I looked at how the game mechanics worked in the video games, health, healing, damage types, armor, and that sort of thing. And there were lots of principles that seemed usable. So then I looked at relative markers, the strongest and weakest, the fastest and slowest. I knew if I knew these, everything else could be spread within those limits. So I started plotting maximums and minimums and had vast amounts of spreadsheets, as I find with any game design. And I plotted out stats and damage and hit points and so on. And if I could understand the relative spread of these things in the video games, I could portray the same thing, or the same feel of Fallout, by roughly rescaling those numbers. And rescaling would definitely be needed, because I think numbers from a video game almost certainly won't be directly usable for a tabletop game. And some examples of this a bit later. Conversely, I identified areas where game mechanics required for tabletop had no equivalent in the video games. Tabletop is turn-based, so a turn order system is going to be needed. As I mentioned, movement and measurement will be needed, but I'll talk about mechanics more in the next section. My familiarity with the source material really helped me tie my game mechanics to those of the video game, so it would feel like Fallout. The Fallout's got many versions. Could they be combined? Are there any conflicts between them? And if there were, how would we choose which one was going to be the one that would win out? So the license covered the 4 numbered games, and a couple of years into the project, New Vegas got added as well. Fallout 76 was an unknown and yet to be released at this point. Fortunately, Fallout's setting, while spread across quite a few decades, actually feels quite similar, and crossover feels quite natural. So that was actually good news. And the primary differences really were the characters, the locations, and the weapons. But awareness of all the games to be covered from the start was actually really useful. We were going to release expansions in waves, new content, new models, new units, and so on. So that would cover all different parts of the Fallout world, but designing each wave in sequence, just doing the only bit that I needed at the time, could create inconsistencies, or it could not leave enough room for things I needed to insert later. So I designed blocks of content at a time. So for example, I did all the types of synths I could find, all in one go, and statted them out, even though I wouldn't need them all straight away, rather than doing a few and then trying to add more later on. So the good news was the different versions looked like they'd fit pretty well without big issues. It wasn't all plain sailing, though. For example, I noticed some equipment changes, like power armor especially changed relative strength, or even swapped the order as which one was more powerful in some of the games. One surprise to me was that the weapons in New Vegas were so different to those in Fallout 4. But this research meant I could plan ahead for that, and again, leave space for these sorts of things and consider it from the beginning. As Fallout 4 was the latest in the current game at the time, Fallout 4 would be the starting point for the content, and if there were any issues, any older elements would be seen through a Fallout 4 lens if we needed to choose between them. So a license setting, it'll often provide only what's needed for the source medium. As a result, it can lack detail or variety needed for a tabletop game. If only a single character of an alien species is seen in a film, we don't know anything more about the rest of that species, because that's all that's needed for the source medium. If X-Wing had been made in 1977, an Imperial player would have only turned up with an entire bag full of TIE fighters, maybe one TIE Advance for Vader, but that's all they'd have. So wargames require units with a spread of different functionalities, or a side could be too vulnerable or unusable. So I needed to fill some of these gaps. In Fallout 4, the Brotherhood of Steel that you meet are mostly power armor-wearing veterans. So for Brotherhood of Steel in Wasteland Warfare, I was going to need some less expensive or worse units to add depth and flexibility to a player who just wanted to play a Brotherhood of Steel side. So I used any scrap of information I could find, rank titles mentioned only once, people that were mentioned but never seen, and so on, across all of the games, to try and give me some initial starts on where I might be able to create these extra things from. Some could be used directly, but this analysis did mean any new elements would have more natural fit. And the same was true for weapons, equipment, in fact, anything that I needed that I didn't have directly from video games. But also, wargames need some gaps in tactical complexity or capability. No single unit or force should be able to do or be the best at everything, because that means there's a solution, and that makes the game no fun and breaks it. So I actually needed to leave some gaps as intentional weakness as well. Everything needed license of approval, of course. Ultimately, Fallout wasn't my story to tell, so creative freedom had some limits, but I could still be creative and make new things with these sort of kernels or pieces of information as their base. And Bethesda were always really helpful, very accommodating and agreeable, which really helped. So I extracted some world rules. Robots can't use food or chems, super mutants can't wear power armor. However, I noticed that Fallout is a world of exceptions. Intelligent super mutants, Brotherhood of Steel members working to save synths rather than trying to wipe them out, characters that switch sides or aren't who they seem, tame deathclaws, the list went on. So exceptions were everywhere, and it just felt that was very Fallout. So it was clear that fewer restrictions in Wasteland Warfare of what you could utilize together would be better to allow players to portray the world of Fallout any way that they wanted. I did create some faction rules, though, because that's just what war games have. Players usually play a single faction, and they have an overarching set of rules to give that faction-like identity. Unfortunately, a few months after launch, I realized that that identity was actually already baked into all the unit cards, so the ones for each model, and players could play any mix of factions, so actually faction rules and cards weren't needed at all, so I tried to remove them. But it was too late. And wargamers actually, I found, saw factions without faction cards as weak, even if all those rules were baked into their cards individually, so they did end up remaining. But Fallout, as well as exceptions, is a world of variety. So to deliver this, I knew I was going to have to create myself some tools at the start which could provide the massive variety in all of the units, weapons, and equipment needed. Or I'd quickly run out of room while designing further waves. And by units, I mean just like individual models or, just models in general. So you could have multiple models of the same unit or individual characters, but units is the term I'll use. So using a variety of weapons and equipment is also a really big part of Fallout, the video game experience. For simplicity, we decided that cards would be used rather than paper rosters for someone's force. So that would make it easy to mix and match units with weapons as you wanted to. Also, it would make the game feel a bit less war-gamey, so a bit more approachable for the general gamers, more visual, a bit more immediate. And actually, it was a good choice to give this variety, but we learned along the way that wargamers actually, some wargamers preferred rosters, so a list of all their units and all their abilities, rather than cards. And actually, after a lot of waves of products over the years, having lots of cards did become slightly tricky to manage for players if they had a lot. But it's not something that we had noticed right from the beginning. I'm a really big believer in right tool for the right job when it comes to this sort of game. I think it makes for interesting decision-making and increased tactics during a game. So, for example, if your opponent needs to access terminals, you can prioritize stopping their models who can hack them, but that tactical texture's lost if every opposing model can do the hacking. So as mentioned, some restrictions were needed to avoid every model being able to do everything, as that would just eliminate all the tactical depth. So also in the world of Fallout, you are never safe. Given enough time, even the strongest is never safe from the weakest, which I discovered whilst concentrating in the night at trying to shoot people in the distance while a mole rat was killing me by biting my leg, and I hadn't even noticed. So to portray this, I would need to ensure that nothing was too powerful and nothing was too weak. And also, within that, there was enough range to fill in with enough variety. And we'll come back to that point a bit later. But probably, and obviously or understandably, the video game's gameplay provided many elements to deliver the experience of the setting. And this includes game mechanics. Like I said, we'll cover those in the next section. But some general gameplay principles to be included were really clear too. The action in Fallout has a reason. It's not controlling arbitrary or abstract control points or fighting to the death for no reason. There's usually, or always really, a storyline reason behind it. I knew I'd look to create non-combat objectives to try to achieve this, so that would add story to the game. And making combat it would make combat a tool rather than being just the pure goal. Also, non-combat skills, so hacking, lockpicking, and searching, are really present in the video games, especially because of the mini-games that some of those things offer whilst you're playing. So many of the characters in video games, they're actually suited to combat. So actually these non-combat skills, if they had those, it could give a lot more of the characters from the Fallout video games relevance in a war game. Also, I really like asymmetry in games. I think it gives more tactical depth, but also it makes varied games. I really like looking at a table, the same situation, but having a different perspective compared to the other player because of the asymmetry. So asymmetric forces and also asymmetric scenarios suited Fallout, the video games, really well too. So that's where I would focus. And also, loads of flavour in Fallout comes from like minor incidents, like booby traps, lock safes, creatures hiding in the rubble, strangers to talk to, finding a note, lots and lots of things. They're not the quests, or maybe they're the end point of some of them, but usually they're just other things that happen along the way, and that really adds flavour to the vast area that you're covering. But they're incidental. But I realised that Wasteland Warfare just wouldn't feel Fallout without these, so I would look for a way to try and include that. So now I had the boundaries, and I knew what elements of the setting needed conveying, but what about the game mechanics? Excuse me. So the video games have many of the same type of game mechanics, as I mentioned before, that the war game would need, so resolving combat, have health levels, damage, armor. But could these be useful? So I went through and I extracted kind of the feel and intent of each mechanic in the source and considered their playability and also their practicality for a war game. Unsurprisingly, none of them were directly usable. So there's going to have to be changes. So they'd either need to have be included by converting them into some kind of tabletop game mechanic or mechanism, but I'll use the phrase mechanic, or they'd need to be cut. The thing is that when you create new mechanics, if you deviate from the source too little, then the game mechanic will be unplayable in a tabletop game, but deviate from the source too much, and it won't feel like the source at all. On the other side, when cutting mechanics, if you omit too few, it will still be unplayable, and if you omit too many, it also won't feel like the source. So there's a real balance to be struck between whether keeping them or losing them. Some elements, though, were really clear from the start. They just weren't going to work, so they needed to be cut. Hit locations, so legs, arms, torso, head, added too much detail whilst being a big part of Fallout when you play. So these got cut because of the detail and the amount of bookkeeping when you're actually going to be controlling quite a few different characters, not when you play Fallout in the video games, you're controlling just yourself. So those were cut just for really being impractical. Also, while some skills, like I mentioned, were iconic, like hacking and lockpicking, quite a few weren't relevant in a war game, so there was no clear way or reason to include them, so those were cut too. So stats and tests. If not the, core part of a miniatures game are stats and how to make stats during a game. Tests, rather. Sorry, how to make tests during a game. I felt the special stats in the video game, which are 7 stats across the video games, they all use them, so it's strength, perception, endurance, so it spells out the word special. They're so iconic to the Fallout games that they had to be used, not if possible, they just had to be used, I thought. And the values range from 1 to 10, sometimes larger, but usually 1 to 10 for those stats, like the video games. That seemed very suitable too. It's like a manageable number, would work well with dice. So if stat values are 1 to 10, the initial thought would be just use a 10-sided dice, right? Roll equal to or under your stat, and you succeed. The trouble with that is that players won't want to use, or even attempt, any skill that's got a very low chance of success, especially in a game where actions were going to be quite precious. On the other hand, skills that are too good, they're almost certain to succeed. They really kill tension and ruin games. They're not fun to play against, and actually they're not really that fun to use either. So using a 10-sided dice, I realised, would only leave me 5 values that were usable for stats. And that would leave very little room for variety between the characters that I knew that I absolutely required. So I decided to do things differently. So I used a 20-sided dice to make all of the 10 skill values relevant or useful. So these are the 20 faces I created across the bottom. So there are 5 ones. They do show icons instead of the number 1 because they have small extra effects too, but they're ones. So as a result, if someone had a skill value of 1, then they had a 25% chance of success. And that's actually much better than like a 1 in 6 chance in a 6-sided dice that many other war games have. So it would mean that having a low skill would be usable and people would try to use it. At the other end, there are 3 automatic failures. So no skill value, no matter how high, is ever or would ever be a guaranteed success. So the maximum chance of success would be 85%. Sadly, I discovered there wasn't a 17-sided dice, which is what I really wanted after that. So I added a few duplicates to make it up to 20 in the middle there. So this summarizes the chances for each stat value 1 to 10. So, for example, a skill value of 5, there near the middle, has a 45% chance. So this result was now I could use the full spread of the stat values, 1 to 10, and even go higher, to deliver lots of variety, and I'm glad it did, because boy did I need it. I wish I'd explained these probabilities more directly in the rulebook, though. So players better appreciated low skill values were still useful, just to avoid kind of habitual prejudices some players have towards low stat values in games, and well, I'm not doing that. It's only got a stat value of 1 when actually it was a decent chance. But as mentioned, Fallout's a world of variety, so I needed tools with which to create characters with this variety. Now, already knowing the maximums and minimums that I mentioned earlier to represent with these stats, and also that relative spread of the stats that I also mentioned, it was fairly simple in the end, surprisingly, to allocate values to units. I often created, as I mentioned, values together, all in one go of blocks, so they fit together and there wouldn't be any clashes later. But I also created some general guidelines for myself for groups to give them a flavour, like a common fit, to make them feel cohesive. So like low intelligence for raiders was one that I sort of stipulated in general. Not always, but for most. But many games, they sort of pair each skill with a specific stat. So you tend to find strength. That determines their melee skill. Their agility determines their shooting skill, and their endurance is their health. I was thinking this is too limiting, really. Fallout characters have got different reasons for being good or bad at what they do. So I wanted, for example, units which were strong to be able to be good or bad at melee combat. So I created a list of skills. This is the majority of them. The top ones are like many other miniature games with combat. And the last three are unusual for a miniatures game, but they're the ones I mentioned that are synonymous with Fallout. But rather than hard code each skill to a single specific stat, I placed icons next to the stat I felt relevant for that particular unit that I was trying to portray. So any icon could be next to any stat. So to make a test, you'd use the value for the stat where that skill's located. So for example, there we're making shooting a rifle. The rifle icon's next to perception, and that says roll 7 or less on that 20-sided dice that we just saw. And it was this gave me great flexibility and definition that I could give to these characters. So for example, the huge super mutant, the Behemoth, could be insanely strong, but at the same time not a skilled fighter because they're slow and lumbering. So I could detach those two elements. So I made their strength 13, but attached the melee skill to their perception, which is only 3. If strength had always determined melee, then that wouldn't have been possible. They'd be really strong and then would always be hitting really well all the time. So different characters could use different stats for the same skill. So for search, as example, a brute uses their perception, but soul survivor uses their intelligence. Similarly, for health, a brute can survive in combat, a super mutant, because they're tough using their endurance, whilst dog meat, one of your companion dog, can survive in combat because they're agile. But it also meant I could create units with any number of and mixture of skills too, including ones like this iBot, with only a few skills. I also used any detail from the video games I could find to reinforce how each unit was different too, and some had special abilities, maybe 2 or 3 at most, which are down in the box there. So in the end, this toolset actually let me create over 250 unit cards, and all of them were unique. So next, there are 2 linked aspects, armor and also never safe, that I talked about a bit earlier. So Fallout has very recognizable different armors, and also power armor is incredibly tough. An example of power armor seen there second from the right. So I assessed the armor ratings in the video game. As I mentioned, I looked at all the source data I could find, and with their numbers, a full suit of normal armor gives an armor rating of around 20 for light leather, up to 120 for synth armor. Well, that's quite a big range to cover, to convey, because the strongest being 6 times the weakest. But the armor rating of the toughest power armor is 100 times the lowest normal armor. So I realized I couldn't have all powerful models. I couldn't leave power armor out, and I needed a range of different power armor or non-power armor grades to play with as well. So that was actually quite a design challenge. So as mentioned, power armor is really tough. Everything can kill you, and also we now know that health will be based on a stat, and that would probably be between 1 and 10. So I thought, well, the average health I'm going to aim for is probably around 5 or 6. And the survivability or pace of attrition that we want for a game like this usually means an average for an unarmored model. They're probably going to get removed after 2 or 3 decent hits. So 2 or 3 hits, if the health was 5 or 6, we could change that last box to read that the average damage then was going to be 2 or 3. That was actually quite nice to kind of know that. That was kind of what I was going to aim for. And that meant I knew that attack damage would probably be between 0 up to 6 for really powerful weapons on average. And that would help me then when I came to create all the weapons. But now I knew what sort of range the damage would be, I could consider how the armor could work too. One way would have been to use a deductive armor system. That's where damage is reduced every time by the armor value of whatever's been hit. I find the problem with that is that a model with an armor of 1 can ignore anything that does only 1 damage. That makes it untouchable to some, and that's a game breaker and boring. So personally, I dislike directly deductive systems for this reason, and also they're really hard to balance at low damage values, which is where I was going to be, as a single increased armor is such a big difference. So I knew I needed to do something different. So I created the armor dice. When you get hit, you roll the armor value, you roll the dice. If you get the armor value or lower, that blocks some damage. That's fairly normal. But actually, I decided what you roll is what you block. Now the dice, you can see the results on over on the side there, goes from 1 to 4. So for example, if you have an armor value of 3, if you roll a 3, you block 3. Roll 2, you block 2. Roll 1, you block 1. But if you roll 4, you block nothing because it exceeds the armor value. So that means that better armor can block more damage, that's good, and also it will block something, or some amount more often if it's higher compared to lower armor. But some attacks can still get through. And I think that sort of occasional failure that's fairly weighted feels more cinematic. Sometimes the tough thing does fail. And I also ruled then that power armor blocks 1 damage as well. So that's in addition to whatever the dice roll might be. And like I said, that's a really, really big difference when you've got very low damage numbers. So here's the armor card, the most powerful armor in Fallout, which is the XO1. If you're wondering what the various lines are on the upside down bit, it's because it tucks under the unit card to show the bonuses that it adds to the stats to the wearer. And also when it takes damage, it gets rotated to the damage side, which gives you a bit less benefit. For the physical armor rating, there were 3 different types of damage, so 3 different types of armor ratings, so physical, energy, and radiation, straight from the video games. The physical armor rating for the power armor there is 3, and then +1, that being the extra 1 guaranteed on top of the roll. So that meant that it could, if the dice roll blocked nothing, then power armor would only block a total of the guaranteed 1. This is the weakest weapon in the game, the Mole Rat Bite. I dislike completely random damage in games because it can be just like a bit disappointing. So I gave weapons a fixed amount of definite damage, shown in the red box there. In this case, just 1. And then weapons had some bonus dice, some extra effects on the bonus dice could include damage. So with 1 bonus yellow dice, the Mole Rat's attack damage can sometimes be 2. And that, as we saw, if the XO1 power armor might only block 1 sometimes, that actually means the toughest armor can be damaged by the weakest weapon. It's a small chance, so I give it that. It's like 1 in 72, so it's not very often, but this is the extreme example, and that meant that everything in the game then was never safe, power armor was very tough, and regular armor, where it didn't have the +1 bit, actually still made a difference to the gameplay and felt like it made a difference. So as mentioned, there was a lot of combat in the Fallout video games, but that's not the entire focus. Players know Fallout for its stories and quests, and I wanted to incorporate that into the main gameplay. Like I said, combat would be a key activity, but not the only goal. So scenario design was absolutely key to this. Most scenarios were given non-combat objectives, like finding missing robot parts, maybe hacking computers to open the exit, getting the water pumps running, laying demolition charges. I mean, it just went on. It was great variety I could play with. Often with, as I mentioned, asymmetrical objectives, maybe asymmetrical layout or win conditions too. Although I should highlight that creating scenarios like this that are interesting for both sides at the same time is a lot more work and requires more testing too. Also, I had models start just further into the action, not right at the edges of the board, or at least if they're at the edges, it would be quite a small board to play on, so that less time was spent just getting to the action. For more story, I had event cards. Pretty common in games, turn one over for that particular round. But I hate sudden big effects in games without notice. Dust storms just don't suddenly appear. So cards with major effects were given an icon, which can be seen at the bottom there, on the back of the card. So those cards get revealed when they get to the top of the deck, so that the round before they actually come into effect. So that way, players get prior notice and can even potentially plan in those effects or take advantage of them when this new situation arises. I also added quest cards. These are minor personal objectives that are layered on top of and completely separate to the scenario. Story is on the front and the task and reward is on the back. And each player could have 1 active per game. It could be anyone that they had. And these mimic side quests in the video game. Some had multiple parts as well, so it had a progression to it too, again like the video game. And these gave each player an extra feeling of kind of a personal story too. So using the non-combat skills that I mentioned, so hacking, searching, and lockpicking, for some objectives actually gave storyline to the scenarios and opportunities for non-combat units to shine too. But also I used these skills for general interaction with the environment. So hack a door to open a shortcut, lockpick a safe to find an extra item, and so on, to feel more like the interaction that you get when playing the video games. But also, scavenging and searching are so core to the gameplay of the Fallout video games too. So I added tokens to facilitate discovery during the games. One type is revealed by going up next to it and interacting with it, like many games. but the other type gets revealed if viewed from a distance. And that really opened up the scenarios that I could create to include discovery during a game, where you might get players to explore the battlefield to try and find whatever it is they're searching for, but they wouldn't have to go right up to see that that may not be the area they need to look in. And some interactions with these tokens, like searching a desk, for example, they might simply award random items, but I wanted them to have unexpected elements too. So I created cards for dangers and creatures and strangers, each with kind of mini tests or decisions to add the variety and the flavor that I mentioned. So for example, a danger might be a tripwire, and it says you trip to tripwire, you have a choice to take cover, which will be definite but reduced damage, or you could test that model's agility to find and replace the pin, which could result either in no damage if you succeed or full damage if you fail. I quite like giving players choice in these decisions and also incorporating the relevant units details into it too, so which model actually discovers this makes a difference. Also, I wanted to represent a growing settlement like the video games too. So a player's force would carry over from game to game if they wanted, but without the negative spiral, where in those sorts of situations, the winner gets stronger after a game whilst the loser is more likely to lose the next one. Necromunda in the 1990s taught me this the hard way, and I wanted to avoid that. So I created a settlement system which lets players buy structures. So get caps from the game, that's your reward, and you can buy structures with them, just on paper, saying what was in your settlement, and that let you keep, gain, store, and use extra cards for the next game, but without affecting the units that they could bring along to that game and their basic equipment. So that meant that the settlement section gave players extra options of what to use in each game, but still both players would start every game with the same amount of points each, so it'd still remain balanced whether you win or lose. And as exploring is so synonymous with Fallout, I added these explore cards, which are like random mini encounters, resulting in some small benefits or minor negatives for the next game. And actually, some of these explore cards had consequences, which got shuffled into the event deck. So something you did in between the games may occur at some point during your next game. VATS is another iconic system for Fallout. It's like a slow-mo bullet time system. To mimic this, I created a system of quick actions. They're just like the normal actions in the game, but they have a small penalty. And I allowed every model to gain and use them. But straight away, the game was bogged down by way too many extra actions, especially lots of interruptions from reactions. It was a mess, and it was really slow. But rather than ditch VATS completely, because it is so iconic, with Fallout, I gave major characters icons, or specific characters icons, allowing only them to use it. And that was much cleaner and allowed me to keep it. But also, excuse me, including a solo and cooperative mode, so players could play versus the game rather than each other, was important, especially for general gamers, and actually at the time, it was quite unusual for a war game. So this would require creating an AI to play against. I tend to find in miniatures board games that mainly the AI just attacks, just goes straight in, or they're very random, and I don't really enjoy that. So I knew it had to be simple, but I wanted an AI which could do any objective, not just combat. It could behave depending on the situation, and also portray the personality of the varied inhabitants of the Fallout world. So I created an AI card for each unit with a simple grid. To determine what an AI model would do each turn, a roll of these special blue dice, which had various symbols for various randomizations in the game, determined which row. The symbols on the dice are weighted, so there was a 3 in 6 chance of the top row, 2 in 6 chance of the middle row, and 1 in 6 chance of the bottom row. And the model's current situation determined which column. So in this case, the brute's health governs this. So if we rolled a bottle on the blue dice and the brute is on 4 health, their response would be this cell. And each cell contained one of 5 letters which determine the AI's actions. So O means do the objective, that's described by the scenario for that side, such as steal the chemicals from the safe. A is attack, and the list of icons and the list of text at the bottom there on the right determines who or how they would attack if there was a choice. So that would try and stop the weak units just suddenly suicidally charging the giant things that they would probably never even attempt. There's also move, defend, and fall back. But just 5 basic responses. Each had some simple rules on how to enact them, and each scenario could provide any extra specifics as well on how to use them. There were some subtle details too, like a shaded or unshaded cell means the model will act recklessly or carefully. Here the brute gets more reckless or angry as its health goes down. And an underline just meant it wouldn't leave melee if it had the choice. But the weightings of the rows, that meant that a unit would be more likely to do one thing than another, given their current situation, but only from a fixed set of these possible behaviours matched to who and what they were, and found that gave them the personality. It was kind of a predictable unpredictability. So the different situations really helped add flavour to the behaviours too, so they weren't just based on health. When not low on health, this particular example, the field scribe here, bases their response on how many friendly models are nearby. If there are two or more, they're confident, mostly objective-focused. But if there's only one or no friendlies around, they're cautious and they won't even try the objective. When I first tested this system, I had some AI super mutants. They ran into my base, they stole the item I was guarding, and they ran off with it while defending the person carrying it. I was really annoyed at beating me, whilst at the same time being really proud of it. It was a very confusing mix of emotions. This toolset allowed me to give over 250 unique AI cards, giving all the Fallout inhabitants their own behaviours to feel like the video game. And that was only possible because I had created a flexible toolset to help me achieve that. Ease of play was important to suit the general gamers. From the start, I used movement rulers rather than tape measures and colour coding. The rulers that are seen here, they're very quick to use, didn't look too wargamey, and rulers had worked well for X-Wing, which is very popular, so that seemed like a good thing to use. Though using rulers was contentious with a few wargamers who preferred tape measures. I colour-coded icons as well to make it easy to find the required stick or the required dice. And I spent a lot of time creating a colour-blind assistance system, which was clear, but also without interfering for non-colour-blind players too. And it used the, you'll see on each of the sticks, the corners are slightly different, and I put those on the icons as well to help pair them together. But also the amount, mixture and colour of a weapon's bonus dice described that weapon's character to a player at a glance too, as each colour was more likely to have one specific effect, so whether it's damage or accuracy or armour reduction for the black, green and yellow dice. Also, I used icons wherever I could, instead of text, to make things quick to read and save space, which was critical with only a limited amount of space on cards. And especially, I'm a big fan of great use of icons in board games too. Critical hits are a big feature in the video games, where a player can fill their critical meter and then activate it for a big and guaranteed hit. So I added a way for models to charge this up and gave each weapon a critical effect too. At first, every model could do this, which you won't be surprised to hear, like that, was far too fiddly and slow to track. So similarly, I ended up giving just some characters or units access to use the critical hits. There were some Fallout elements I was able to include fairly directly. Perks or extra abilities and are very familiar to Fallout players. I included as many as possible using the same names, applying the equivalent benefits, and put them on cards so they could then be given to any unit. Chems are also very much part of Fallout, so I replicated their effects. And like Power Armor, the cards slide under the unit card to show, or align with the unit card to show their benefits, and each round the card slides under by one column to give a reducing effect over time. And if you fail a test afterwards, if you're addicted to them, you rotate it, and that gives you the negative effect if you are addicted. Bosses. Fallout has some incredibly powerful enemies, which are really hard to include in a skirmish game force because they cost so much of your total points, if not your entire force. So actually I made separate cards for bosses to allow them to have different phases. So they'd be like bosses of video games and have changing tactics and changing characteristics as the fight would continue if you played them all in one go. But also, players could use either all the stages. They could use just a single stage if they wanted, and that would mean it was easier to incorporate them into your points cost and put them on the table, and actually it meant it was more often you would get these great, probably very big models actually onto the table. Also, while there were single unit cards for each robot, I mimicked the robot building of Fallout 4 as well by making mix and match cards so players could assemble different head, torso, and legs. So I split them out, so the skills and brain-related skills are on the head card, armor and physical-related stats on the torso, and movement and agility on the leg cards. You can't always win, though. In addition to some of the false starts with the game mechanics I mentioned, mix and match rule sets need clear guides and suggested usage. over the time, I'd created various modules allowing players to play almost any aspect of the Fallout video games, not just purely a combat scenario. So campaigns, exploring the wasteland, generating dynamic vaults, full settlement system, a role-playing game, a solo choose-your-own adventure. I mean, there were a lot of different ways you could play it, but it allowed you to tailor the game to anything you wanted. My experience, though, was that most players actually want to be told what to use, and if not, clear communication is required if it's the players that have to make that choice. But that's actually difficult if later modules that will add these choices aren't known from the beginning, and there were some that we didn't know that we were going to create until later. Also, sometimes there are preconceptions that you can't overcome. I mentioned having the number of sides on the dice can put people off, but also the faction rules as well. And that's fine as long as these things only affect a small number of your audience. But sometimes there's no right choice. Create a small tokens to get enough onto 2 counter sheets. So they weren't, also, they just kind of made sure they weren't intrusive when they're actually on the table. But some players felt they were too small. But if we'd used larger tokens, they would have felt more intrusive on the table, but also it meant there probably wouldn't have been space on these counter sheets for enough, and that would have meant another sheet, and that would increase the retail cost by several dollars to include them. So there really was no winning in this situation. And sometimes you just have to learn the hard way. The one rule I made, like for 50-50 chances, was to flip a counter, like a coin, so like determining if the on-fire token stays or gets removed. What I hadn't thought about, which was crazy because I've played board games for long enough, I should have known, that when the token sheet cutter punches these sheets, it gives a round edge on the top, but it gives a sharp edge still on the bottom. And that means when you flip them onto a table, they're completely biased and will roll onto one side almost all the time. And I discovered this whilst recording a live gameplay with one of the wargame channels, which was slightly awkward. But flipping onto your hand works fine, but most players instinctively, and unblamingly, flip them onto the table. So, what can I conclude? Someone once told me a game should have a maximum 20% innovation. I didn't accept it then, and I still don't believe it now. It depends on what you're making, for sure. I accept it can't be more different than the intended audience will accept, so knowing those design boundaries from the start is really important. But I mean, if innovation had maximum, games that took big leaps would never have existed. Tabletop games like Dominion, Magic the Gathering, Risk Legacy, to name a few. So everything standard now also was different when it was first introduced. And an innovation limit may make it impossible to create the game that you need. Being different does help a game stand out too. It's just important to make sure the differences are because they're better and have good reason, and not just to be different. Some of the mechanics I've mentioned were a slightly different execution of existing ones in war games, while some were new, but all of them were to make the game feel like Fallout or suit the audiences. But being different is not without cost, though. It requires communication to bring those around you on board, and it's not just the players, but also colleagues, directors, investors when you're developing the games. If people don't know your why, then they won't accept your how. I find it really important to take time early on to explain these reasons, to try and take people on the same journey with me. As a result, their feedback will be a lot more relevant. But also, I found nicely that people then also spread that why to other players too. That really helps greatly spread the message. And being different doesn't always mean being more complicated. However, if a game mechanic works contra to how it is normally done in similar games, it actually may feel more complicated than it actually is to players who are familiar with the established approaches. Many of the main mechanics in Wasteland Warfare are slightly different, or a lot different, to existing tabletop games. In isolation, when I looked at them, each of these made sense to portray Fallout, and it seems like a small and reasonable difference. But actually, I realized that when added together, they can make quite a lot of difference for some players. A base game should not be at the maximum difference that the audience can accept, because further products will inevitably add to the differences, even if they're just adding new units or equipment. And this can become too much difference for some players. If I created a second version of Wasteland Warfare, there are areas I'd streamline, which they were very Fallout, but actually they turned out to not be as important to the gameplay in the long run, or they weren't required to use with other characters later on that I would create when I thought they'd be really useful tools to create this variety I've mentioned. So Getting rid of some of those would give more room for complexity increase later down the line, and there's no point having something that communicates the licensing experience if the players then don't use it. Conversely, it's also okay to be the same in places. Using tried and tested methods when that's all that's needed works well, because there's less for players to learn and or adapt to, and also there's less that needs communicating. So knowing when to be different and when to be the same depends on many factors, as I've discussed. A licensed game almost certainly needs to be different in some way to make it feel like the license the players already know and love, as well as stand out and, of course, be fun. A well-known quote from Fallout is that war never changes, but fortunately, game design doesn't have to be the same. Thank you. We've got a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Just before that, just a quick reminder to please fill in the session evaluation you'll receive by email from GDC. That feedback really helps. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to, I'll answer them. Hi there.
Hi. I'm a UX researcher, and I thought it was really interesting that you, at the very beginning, pulled out those two that can be quite different groups, those who are like hardcore war gamers and those who are hardcore Fallout gamers or general gamers. And I was wondering if during playtesting, did you ever like mix the two kind of groups to have them play together? So you might have a friend, say, you know, who does war games, knows someone who loves Fallout. Hey, let's play this together. Or did you usually keep those two groups separate during playtesting?
It's interesting. I think so. Internal playtesting that we were doing, we had a team of 6 playtesters who would play it, and they were pretty much war gamers. And so the person who wasn't was me. So I was a I've played war games in the past, but not as a sort of dedicated hobby. So I was kind of the mixture in that part. But it is interesting, and you're right, it's important to do that. I think we found that when people played, we had like some volunteers who would help us. They'd put on demos in stores and at shows. And so they were usually the war gamers. But then people in the stores would be non-war gamers. And it was interesting. So I did some shows where you'd demonstrate it to people and to have that mix. And yeah, it's quite interesting to see the different reactions and what people liked and didn't like. But yeah, if you're able to do it to mix them up, it's important because you're probably going to find that one person who's going to buy it and be great about it. Yeah, they're going to bring in people who probably aren't as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. So I was wondering if you could speak a little more about, like, over time, how role-playing elements were sort of introduced, and more specifically, kind of how you balance that, because it sort of said that you wanted to keep number and stat values relatively low, because that makes sense for a war game where 2 or 3 hits will take out a character. But as you introduce more like player sort of heroic characters, how do you sort of keep from like a runaway build just taking over the game in that way? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's a way to, I try to restrict people becoming too powerful, was to have this idea of these kind of maximum settings and place them within. I thought it was really important that some of the characters, when you play Fallout, you feel like you are, certainly the character you play, is really strong or powerful and has a lot more skills. So, I wanted, rather than have the unit card and that would be it, I created a thing called a heroic card you could add, and that would actually give you access to things like VATs and critical hits. It might increase it did increase your strength a little bit. So I had a way to kind of boost those characters. But I kind of thought about it with so things like weapons. You know, I had those the bonus dice. When I started out and with all these crazy amount of spreadsheets, I kind of worked out what if I put everything. It was all the dice. Everyone likes rolling lots of dice. What is all of them? Would that break this? Yeah, it did to start with. So I had to sort of tone it down or understand what the limits were. So it was important to do that. So I kind of gave people choice of what they could mix together, and then limit how much you could add as well. So like you only get like I think it was the maximum perks. There's a maximum number of cards and yeah, limits of what you could take with you. But just a way to try and limit that too. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was really, really fascinating. I'm really interested in how you approached balancing stats between different units. Obviously, with a game like this, it's very complicated and challenging, I imagine. So yeah, I'd love to know if you had any lessons learned from that or yeah, your approach to it.
Yeah, sure. So the question is about balancing the stats. I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. Yeah, it just took, I know it doesn't help much. It was kind of a very handcrafted job. So again, another spreadsheet. And going through and doing these blocks at a time really helped get that separation. So even though we didn't use, like, the synths, I had about, I don't know, 8 or 10 different types that I'd found in the game and had them all at different levels. But they were so similar, it was like too granular, so you wanted them to have decent steps between them. But it was about looking at them and trying to think, okay, well, should they be good at this? Should they be good at that? And actually, so they started off, I'd just go through, write down what I thought and just see how that landed. And then after that, I then find that I'd either run out of room in one direction or needed to start higher up somewhere else. As I went down they got worse. That's the synths or whatever they were. So it was really a lot of like looking at it, but actually knowing them so well and then doing all of these units actually allowed me to keep that in mind and compare them across different places. But I kind of hid in the fact that, took comfort in the fact that I knew that as long as I was within these maximum minimums, I was all right. So I kind of, it wasn't that I didn't care, but at least I knew I couldn't break it too badly if I got it badly wrong. And then the playtesting would help. The playtesters gave some feedback like, yeah, that's too high, that's too low. So I'd kind of go for the best first start, but I was never the final arbiter of what would be.
Thank you so much.
No problem, thanks. Hi.
So with your game where you identify two very sort of different audiences, you got your Fallout fans, your traditional wargaming fans, especially with such an attractive IP, did you feel any extra attention trying to introduce players to maybe a set of mechanics they aren't used to within the genre, or was there any sort of consideration on how you explained these things to potentially new wargamers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So we had, in the box, we had the sort of main rule book, which was then broken into chapters. Actually, at the end of each chapter, you could then go and play a scenario, and not just a tutorial scenario, but something a bit more interesting, but only using those rules. So we tried to introduce the rules slowly. There was also a getting acclimated booklet for people who had never played war games before, which was even a further step back. And then the scenarios and solo rules and stuff were in the other book. So it was interesting to try and introduce those mechanics, and it is difficult if you've got multiple audiences. I think there's a great Facebook group that we had, and that's quite a mixture of people. But there were other medium platforms we could use, like some of the chat forums for wargamers. We could talk to them differently as well. So, but it is difficult though with the two audiences because you really only get kind of one main broadcast, and when there are mechanics that are quite different, that whole explaining the why it is different. Once you explain it and people read it, that was great. But if you don't do it early on, it's really hard to then catch that later and try and get people to come back and go, can I just explain why we've done that way? Because they're already into it and they don't need the detail. So yeah, it's a difficult one, I think, to try and satisfy the two.
Thank you.
No problem, thanks. Hi.
Hi. When building out the base game, are you already thinking of what mechanics you're going to add in future expansions? And then if so, how do you determine which mechanics to add to the game?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because we knew we were going to do waves and waves of miniatures, but we also knew the things you're going to add were going to be quite modular. So the units and the weapons might be different, but probably no new rules. So the pressure was on really at the start to make sure we had all the rules we needed to cover everything. So that was a bit tricky, and that's why some of the rules that we had didn't really get used as much as maybe the space they took up in their rulebook, like a battle cry, we can scare the other models and force them back. In the end, didn't really need to be there. But it was there just because it seemed like we'd need it. But the idea was no new major rules, unless it was for a specific module for that alone. So yeah, we tried to make sure there wasn't extra rules later, because the complexity would come from having more models, different abilities and stuff.
Thank you.
No problem, thanks. Hi.
You mentioned having the 6 playtesters on your team. I just have like a bunch of questions revolving around that. So I'm more on the digital video game side. I haven't been privy to tabletop manufacturing. So what's the cadence? Are the playtesters playing every day, regardless if you have new mechanics? And are you involved in every playtest? And what are like some of the things that you are observing about the playtest and getting feedback on? I guess there's a lot, like, do they get paid like as full time and they're just playing every day regardless of a new build coming in? And what is the cadence of a new build, so to speak? How often do you introduce things?
So it's interesting, the way, I don't know how other people might do it, but the way that we were doing it. Sorry, I get a signal from the back. We've done now. So unfortunately we're out of time, but we'll carry on at the afterwards at the what's it called, the wrap-up areas. So I'll answer your question, yeah, which is at 3014 or 3018. So we'll go straight out to that. And I can answer any other questions people have too. Thanks. Thank you.